Ethnic Study 3024, Intro to Critical Sports Studies. Today, the Olympics, the past, the present, and the future of a movement. In 1896, the modern Olympic Games were born, trying to celebrate the ancient Olympic Games, but now in this modern era. Throughout the world, in the Western world, athletics, physical education, and sport was popularizing for various reasons, some of which we've already discussed this semester. Earlier in the course, we examined modernity in the United States and the rules and structures that were beginning to form in various sports in the United States. Olympic foundations, the 19th century sport, well, the purpose of this was to keep people, men primarily, busy and fit, especially as world conflicts increase. Who had the most free time to participate? Well, middle-class individuals. Early definitions of amateur only included people who did not earn a salary at all. Urbanization makes it easier to conduct competitions, so teams and clubs really developed largely in cities. Club system eventually dominates in Europe, and the university system in the United States. Universities and their resources helped build facilities and organized these sports and helped them become much more popular in the United States. Interest in ancient culture and ideals, well, the revitalization Olympics attempted throughout the 19th century to do this, to bring more awareness of ancient culture. The first games in Athens, Greece in 1896, grand ideas, practical issues. Baron Pierre de Coubertin, a French aristocrat, spent nearly a decade organizing the first games. He traveled throughout the United States and Europe, France, England, and Sweden primarily, to learn about how sports were being played and structured. He entered facilities and tried to see what were the best facilities that could host such games. Greece was forced to host the games, even though they were concerned about the cost and infrastructure construction, and were annoyed with the cultural appropriation of Greek culture and history. A concern also for these games were competition rules, guidelines for amateurism, and the cost of travel. By 1932 in Los Angeles, necessity created a tradition. What do I mean by this? Well, the 1932 games in Los Angeles occurred during the Great Depression. The United States and much of the world engulfed in this Great Depression. In the United States, the average unemployment rate was at 25%. And so the Olympic Village was created to better organize athletes and reduce costs. Prior to this, athletes came up with their own travel arrangements and plans, and housing was usually done through their own Olympic committee. Well, the LA organizers used a set of hotels to house the athletes together and create this Olympic Village, the village that we still use today. Games were shortened from months-long affair to about 2 weeks. Some of the games went from 2 to 3 months over the summers of previous Olympiads. Yet, to keep this more efficient and cost-effective, the LA Games occurred over a 2-week period, the same system that we use for the medal events in the Olympic Games today. Existing facilities were utilized, although some were retrofitted. Again, today, as host nations or nations bid to become host nations of the Olympic Games, when they go to the IOC, part of their bid is to demonstrate that they already have the infrastructure, they already have the stadiums ready to host such a facility, and thus anything else that will have to be built will easily be done in a 7-year period post the award of who is going to host the team and the actual Olympic Games themselves, usually about a 7-year period. And the games were heavily marketed to draw interest. A lot of this marketing came from Hollywood. When people went to see a local movie in a local movie house, unlike today where you have 7, 8, maybe 10 coming attractions of feature films, what they did back in 1932, the pre-movie videos were really propaganda to help support the Olympic Games and draw interest. Politics present from the beginning? Well, politics and sport have long gone hand in hand. the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, faced their first true international conflict with the outbreak of World War I and decided to give Antwerp, Belgium, the 1920 Games over Budapest, Hungary after canceling the 1916 Games, while banning Germany and other Central Powers from competition. When Berlin was given the 1936 Games in 1931, particularly to welcome them back into the IOC, they were used as a platform by Adolf Hitler to promote Nazism. The Games were also canceled in 1940 and 1944 in London due to World War II. More political stances. Well, first, large-scale boycott occurs in 1956 in Melbourne, Australia, due to the Suez Crisis, USSR's invasion of Hungary, and the IOC's recognition of Taiwan. South Africa was banned from participation in the Olympics from 1964 to 1992 due to apartheid policies. In 1968, podium protests by Tommie Smith and John Carlos at the Mexico City Games, also preceded by the massacre that occurs of students in Mexico just a month earlier. I want to talk about Tommie Smith and John Carlos for a moment. We'll examine this later when we discuss race, ethnicity, and sport later in the semester. But those of you that are familiar with the 1968 Olympic protests that occurred, this was Tommie Smith and John Carlos who finished with gold medals and bronze medals in the, I believe this was the 200-meter run. During their Olympic ceremony, they unbuttoned their warm-up suits, stepped onto the platform barefoot, and held a fist in the air with a black glove on it. This was a protest, a social protest of racism in the United States in 1968, the same year of the assassination of Martin Luther King, earlier that year in May. And the significance about this has to do with what the historical memory is that we have of Tommie Smith and John Carlos. The fist with the black glove is all that people seem to remember and focus on. However, while that was a black power salute, what people have forgotten, and what the media at the time and the journalists did not report, was the openness of their warm-up jerseys. That was a demonstration of them protesting the abuse of working-class Americans. They were arguing for better pay and better hours for the millions of Americans in low-paying working-class jobs. That is absence of race or ethnicity there. Their argument was all purely about economics. And lastly, the bare feet, as they stepped on the podium, the bare feet symbolized poverty in America and homelessness. Once again, a colorblind issue. But that is not what the press and the media focused on. They made this solely about the racial injustice that they were arguing about in the United States with their Black Power salute. Also, later, boycotts by African nations and a refusal to recognize Taiwan by Canada at the 1976 Montreal Games. Another example of more political protests. Influence of the Olympic movement. Something that is largely absent from our historical memory of the Olympics are art exhibitions, and competitions are also an often overlooked part of the Games. Winter Olympics also started in 1924, the same year as the Summer Games, until 1994. 1992 is the last year that the Summer and Olympic Games occurred during the same Olympiad. For financial reasons and for networks to make more money and advertisers to plan for these games, the games were switched to alternate 2-year periods so that there would not be, it would be only 2 years in between any one of the two Olympiads. First Paralympic Games in Rome in 1960. Well, this started as a competition among war veterans, disabled veterans. Youth Olympic Games start in 2010. Similar events like the Pan American and Inter-University Games, as well as games such as the Gay Games for the LGBT community. These are all events that are influenced by the Olympic movement. 1964 to 1976, well, this has been considered a bumpy road to modernization of this Olympiad. The Tokyo Games in 1964 were the first to broadcast over satellite, but less than 6 hours of live coverage actually made it to the United States. the 1968 and 1972 games were marked by violence and tone-deaf reactions to political displays and concerns, even as they tried to welcome more countries into the movement. The 1972 Olympic Games that I want to mention, the violence that occurred there, terrorists attacked at the Olympic Village in 1972, and they sought out the Israeli team. They kept, I believe, 16 Israeli athletes hostage before eventually executing them at the 1972 Olympic Games. Because of this, the 1976 Games in Montreal it was overrun by expenses, $1.48 billion to be exact, creating questions about the Games' financial viability. Because of this, the 1980 Olympic Games that had already been selected, the host city had already been selected to be Moscow, Soviet Union, was set, but as a result, no one was bidding for the 1984 Olympic Games. I'll get to that one in just a moment. But in 1980, the United States, for the Summer Olympic Games, at the decision of President Jimmy Carter, decided to boycott the Olympic Games in Moscow, Soviet Union, because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. While athletes trained for the Olympics, knowing that there was not going to be an Olympiad for them, they continued to train. Many sports even carried out their Olympic qualifications, such as the Olympic trials. In swimming and in gymnastics, athletes still performed and were named to an official Olympic team, even though none of them traveled to the Soviet Union for the 1980 Summer Olympic Games. The Winter Olympic Games that had preceded the Summer Games saw the U.S. defeat the Soviet Union in the semifinal round of ice hockey. This was an amazing feat because at the time the question of amateurism was very important. Many of the Soviet players were all professional hockey players, while in the United States they still preserved the amateur status, and the team was made up of largely college hockey players. The U.S. went on to the gold medal game, while the Soviet Union went on to the bronze medal game. But by 1984, the United States, the only nation to bid for the Olympics, because of this, really could transform the games into anything they wanted. What they did, they used sponsorships. This was something that was largely not done in previous Olympic Games. The International Olympic Committee wanted to preserve this amateur status and amateur ideal of the Olympic Games, not have this be spoiled by profiting and large corporations bidding for their name and likeness on buildings and structures. Well, since no other nation bid for the Olympic Games, the Los Angeles Olympic Committee used corporate America at will. You had sponsors such as McDonald's, still a long-standing sponsor of the Olympic Games today, Kodak Camera, and many others sponsor the Olympic Games. This was a financial success for the United States, and thus a plan that future nations used in order to make their Olympic Games successful financially. So the modern Olympic Games still have current issues. These issues revolve around money, cost, greed. Doping and cheating has long been a problem in Olympic sport. Inclusion and exclusion, rules and regulation, and definitions of amateur. Inclusion and exclusion is an interesting discussion, and that is how to include transgender athletes. Who will they participate as? Will they participate by the gender on their birth certificate or the gender that they identify? So questions like these will be questions that the International Olympic Committee will have to examine moving forward. Money and cost. Well, operating a large international event of thousands of participants and millions of spectators there around the world, the cost and around the world costs a little bit of money. What's the biggest cost for countries, cities, and hosting the Olympic Games? Now it looks as though, moving forward, security will be one of the biggest concerns, financially. And corruption often costs organizers billions as well. Examples of this will be with the scandals that occurred in Montreal and in Sochi. And then there's the hypocrisy of the International Olympic Committee. A good example of this is Avery Brundage, the USOC, the United States Olympic Committee president from 1928 to 1952. As the U.S. Olympic Committee president, he oversaw the 1936 Olympics, where Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. Prior to those games, though, African-American civil rights leaders were urging Owens not to participate in the Olympic Games, to boycott this. He was the best international athlete at this time in track and field, and the United States, of course, wanted to go to Germany and defeat the German athletes in front of Adolf Hitler. Brundage did not support such a protest, and thus Jesse Owens did compete at these Olympic Games. The 1968 Games, where Smith and Carlos demonstrated their social protest of injustices against African Americans in the United States, led to Brundage penalizing them. He sanctioned them and boycotted them from any future sporting activity in the United States for track and field. And the increased commercialization, though, with questions about distribution of money, bribery, and bids process, this is the problem with the hypocrisy of the International Olympic Committee. Other problems moving forward will be rules and regulations. Not everyone plays the game the same way, resulting in discrepancies in the way games are played and officiated. Standardization of rules and the influence of more powerful National Olympic Committees often favor nations with more resources. Golf over baseball, for example. Another example of having more resources would be with the U.S. women's gymnastics team. Over the last 4 Olympiads, they've won 2 silver medals and 2 gold medals in the women's team competition, along with the coveted all-around title, I believe, in the last 4 Olympic Games. But they're at an advantage. The U.S. Gymnastics Federation, prior to the Olympic Games, identifies what equipment is being used at the actual maker of the equipment that will be used at the Olympic Games, and orders the same equipment. Not only do the young women get to train on this material and these apparatus, they travel with them. Travel with this large equipment shipped to a neighboring city from, say, Rio for this past Olympic Games, where they set up a camp and they can train on the equipment. Now, while all equipment is to be the same as far as the same height, the same width, the products themselves can be slightly different. For example, the grip on the uneven bars, or the footing on the floor exercise, sometimes often more bouncier than others, and thus these athletes have a month, sometimes 6 weeks to train on this equipment so that they are familiar with it when they compete during the Olympic Games. An athlete from Argentina, a single athlete representing the nation, going to the gymnastics competition, will be at a slight disadvantage, if not a severe disadvantage, by not having the opportunity to train on the same equipment. And doping and cheating. We'll get into this later in the semester and in the discussion of deviance in sport, so I won't get into too much of this, but doping scandals have had a consistent place in the Olympics, from the use of alcohol and strychnine to amphetamines. Death in 1960 led to testing, first suspension in 1968, and Ben Johnson in 1988 created this heightened awareness of the problems with performance-enhancing drugs at the Olympic Games. Amateur status, as I said, will be a concern. A good example of amateur status that had long been the case with athletes at the Olympic Games was with Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe, a Native American, part of the Sac and Fox Nation, competed for the United States in 1912 at the Summer Olympic Games. He was stripped of his gold medals, though, when it was discovered. He played semi-professional baseball a year earlier, and those medals, though, were eventually returned to him in 1983 or to his family 30 years after his death. Following the 1912 Games, he went on to play professional football, baseball, and basketball, and a successful athlete. Inclusion and exclusion. Bill, as stated earlier, Western countries and those with more resources often dominate the organizations of the Olympics, along with the medal counts. The IOC continues to struggle with equal inclusion of female athletes, and those covering the Games face the same issues we see women's sport in the United States. Finally, in conclusion, the size of the Olympics and the global participation makes it one of the most visible and celebrated cultural events in the world. As we have discussed throughout the first portion of the semester, sports, particularly an event of this size, cannot remove itself from politics, even as it tries to embody the great sports myth. The Olympics are at a crossroads. Technologically speaking, ideologically speaking, and economically speaking, the next few games in Tokyo and Paris continue to determine the future of the games. Actually, the 1924 games, it looks as though it may actually be Paris, but that decision will be made later this summer.